The loudest laugh in the room is often the one that dies first. The first rays of the morning sun stretched across Falcon Ridge Air Base as hundreds of service members prepared for one of the year's largest military demonstration events. Maintenance crews moved with practiced precision, helicopters rested silently on the flight line, and families gathered behind security barriers waiting for the gates to officially open. The atmosphere carried the familiar mixture of excitement, discipline, and quiet pride that only a military installation could create. Near the entrance reserved for veterans, an older man stepped out of a weathered pickup truck that looked almost as old as he was. His name was Michael Carter. At 72 years old, his movements were slower than they once had been, but there was nothing uncertain about the way he stood. His faded denim jacket had seen countless winters, his boots had long ago lost their shine, and a worn baseball cap shaded silver hair that had escaped beneath the brim. As he adjusted a small canvas bag over his shoulder, the sleeve of his jacket slipped back just enough to reveal a weathered black tattoo wrapping around part of his forearm. Time had softened the ink, but its unusual design was still unmistakable. Michael noticed the sleeve had fallen, quietly pulled it back into place, and continued walking without giving it another thought. A few hundred feet away, a team of Delta operators waited near a transport vehicle before the morning briefing. They were among the youngest and most physically impressive soldiers on the installation, carrying themselves with the confidence that came from years of elite training. Their unofficial leader, Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks, noticed the elderly man crossing the pavement. Ethan nudged one of his teammates and pointed toward Michael's arm just as the older veteran reached for his visitor's pass. "Did you catch that tattoo?" Ethan said with a grin. "Looks like somebody watched too many action movies back in the day." Several of the operators laughed. One shook his head and added, "Maybe he's hoping someone mistakes him for some legendary secret operator." Another leaned against the vehicle and chuckled. "Either that or he got it at a county fair for $20. The laughter spread quickly through the small group. None of them spoke loudly enough to draw attention from the nearby visitors, but every word reached Michael with perfect clarity. He paused for only half a second before continuing toward the security checkpoint. His expression never changed. He neither defended himself nor acknowledged the remarks. He simply thanked the military police officer who checked his identification, accepted his visitor badge, and walked onto the base as though nothing unusual had happened. Ethan watched him disappear toward the display area and smirked. "Guess I was right," he said. "Real heroes don't need fake ink." None of the younger operators noticed an elderly retired chief master sergeant standing several yards away. The old airman had heard every word, yet instead of interrupting, he quietly lowered his coffee cup and watched Michael continue down the flight line with an expression that was impossible to read. In the distance, engines began warming for the morning demonstrations while loudspeakers announced that a distinguished guest would soon arrive for the opening ceremony. Across the sprawling airfield, no one could have guessed that within the next few minutes, one quiet greeting would erase every joke that had just been told. Michael Carter walked slowly along the display line, stopping now and then to admire the aircraft that reflected decades of engineering and sacrifice. Children pointed excitedly toward the fighter jets while veterans exchanged quiet handshakes and familiar smiles. Every few steps someone nodded politely to Michael, assuming he was simply another retired service member enjoying the event. He returned each greeting with the same calm warmth, never seeking attention and never correcting anyone's assumptions. Behind him, Ethan Brooks and the other Delta operators finished their equipment inspection before receiving permission to explore the exhibition area until the official ceremony began. Instead of letting the encounter fade away, Ethan continued thinking about the faded tattoo he had seen beneath Michael's jacket sleeve. "I have seen people try to impress strangers before," he said with a confident laugh. "That one might be the oldest attempt I have ever seen." A few teammates laughed again. One operator shrugged and replied, "Maybe he wants people to think he belongs to some classified unit." Another added, "The stories are probably even better than the tattoo." They all chuckled as they followed the crowd toward the static aircraft displays. A few minutes later they noticed Michael standing alone near an old military transport aircraft, reading the small historical plaque mounted beside it. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with his teammates before walking closer. "Sir?" he called with an almost playful tone. "That tattoo looks interesting. Is there a story behind it, or is it just something to start conversations?" Michael turned slowly and met Ethan's eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet patience that seemed almost out of place amid the young operator's confidence. He smiled gently and answered, "Every mark on a person's skin has a story. Some are meant to be shared. Some are meant to be remembered." Ethan grinned as though he had confirmed his own suspicion. "That sounds mysterious enough," he replied. "I guess everyone likes a good legend." Michael simply nodded once. "Perhaps," he said softly before turning his attention back to the aircraft. His calm response somehow made the younger men even more uncomfortable than an argument would have. They had expected defensiveness or exaggerated stories. Instead, they received neither. As they walked away, one operator quietly asked Ethan if they should just leave the veteran alone. Ethan shrugged with a smile that suggested the exchange was harmless. "Relax," he said. "We are just having a little fun. If he cannot laugh about it, that is not our problem." Nearby, the retired Chief Master Sergeant who had witnessed the earlier remarks continued observing from a distance. His expression grew more serious each time he watched Michael respond with quiet dignity instead of wounded pride. He looked as though he recognized something that the younger operators could not possibly understand. Across the airfield, preparations suddenly became more formal. Military police adjusted their positions. Event staff checked radios. A convoy of dark vehicles entered through the main gate under careful escort. Visitors noticed the movement and began whispering among themselves. The announcement over the loudspeaker confirmed that a distinguished guest had officially arrived and would inspect the exhibition before addressing the audience. Ethan barely paid attention. He remained convinced that the elderly man with the faded tattoo was nothing more than another retired veteran holding on to stories from a distant past. Michael, however, quietly glanced toward the approaching convoy for only a brief moment before lowering his eyes again to the weathered plaque beside the aircraft. A faint smile crossed his face, as though he already knew exactly who had just arrived and what was about to happen. The activity across Falcon Ridge Air Base began to shift as the arrival of the distinguished guest moved from announcement to reality. A line of official vehicles rolled smoothly along the perimeter road, their presence subtle but unmistakably important. Personnel along the flight line straightened their posture instinctively, and conversations lowered into respectful silence as the convoy approached the central viewing area. Ethan Brooks and his Delta operator team paused near a static aircraft display, noticing the change in atmosphere. Even Ethan, who had spent most of the morning joking and observing with casual confidence, instinctively adjusted his stance when he saw the level of coordination unfolding around them. "Looks like the general is here," one of the operators said quietly. Ethan nodded but kept his attention divided. His thoughts still drifted back to the elderly veteran they had mocked earlier. Michael Carter remained near the historical display, reading the weathered plaque with calm focus, as if nothing significant was happening around him. He did not appear impressed by the arrival of high-ranking officials or the growing attention across the base. Instead, he seemed almost detached from the moment, as though he had experienced far greater events in his life than a formal inspection. The convoy finally came to a stop near the central reviewing platform. The doors opened, and General Robert Anderson stepped out with measured authority. He was an older man, carrying the unmistakable presence of someone who had spent decades in command. As he surveyed the base, his eyes moved across the personnel, the aircraft, and the gathered guests. But then his expression changed. It shifted from professional focus to immediate recognition. Without hesitation, the general walked forward, bypassing several waiting officers who had prepared formal greetings. His destination was not the stage, not the aircraft, and not the assembled leadership. He was walking directly toward Michael Carter. The movement caught the attention of everyone nearby. Conversation stopped. Cameras lowered slightly. Even Ethan noticed the shift and followed the general's path with growing curiosity. Michael, still standing beside the display, finally turned as the general approached. The two men locked eyes, and in that moment the entire energy of the air base seemed to narrow into a single point of focus. General Anderson stopped only a few feet away. For a brief second, either man spoke. The silence carried weight, not of tension, but of histories shared between them. Then the general raised his hand in a firm, respectful gesture. "I did not expect to see you here today," he said quietly. Michael offered a small nod. "I heard you were coming," he replied simply. The exchange was brief, but it changed everything about how those nearby perceived the elderly veteran. Ethan frowned slightly, sensing something he could not yet understand. The retired Chief Master Sergeant who had been observing from a distance lowered his gaze for a moment, as if confirming a memory he had long kept to himself. Around them, the crowd began to realize that this was not an ordinary reunion. It carried weight that could not be explained by rank alone. General Anderson glanced toward Michael's forearm for a brief moment before returning his focus to the man's face. His expression softened. "It has been a long time since we stood on the same ground without chaos around us," he said. Michael responded calmly. "Some things do not change just because time passes." Those words seemed to resonate more deeply with the general than anything else said that morning. Ethan, still standing a short distance away, felt a growing unease. The earlier jokes no longer felt harmless. The casual confidence he carried began to shift into uncertainty, as he realized he might have misjudged the situation far more seriously than he had imagined. The general then made a subtle gesture toward the viewing platform, signaling that something important was about to begin, but before moving, he paused again for a brief moment beside Michael. And in that silence, the airfield seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud. The silence around the central reviewing platform grew heavier as General Robert Anderson remained standing beside Michael Carter. The entire air base seemed to adjust itself around that moment, as if every movement had become secondary to whatever was about to unfold. Officers who had been preparing for formal protocols suddenly hesitated, unsure whether to proceed or wait for instruction. Even the loudspeakers, which had been active moments earlier, felt distant now, replaced by the quiet intensity of human attention. Ethan Brooks stood near the aircraft display, no longer joking or speaking with his team. His earlier confidence had shifted into something less certain. He kept watching Michael and the general, trying to understand why a man he had dismissed so easily was now at the center of attention from the highest-ranking officer present. Michael remained composed, his posture unchanged, his expression calm as though the situation was familiar rather than surprising. The general finally turned slightly toward the assembled personnel and raised a hand, signaling a temporary pause in all scheduled activity. The movement was subtle, but it carried immediate authority. Conversations across the airfield stopped completely. He then looked back at Michael and spoke in a tone that was quieter than expected, yet carried clearly across the nearby crowd. "Before we begin the inspection, there is someone here I need to acknowledge," he said. Those closest to the platform exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan stepped forward just slightly, trying to get a better view, while the retired Chief Master Sergeant who had been observing earlier lowered his head again, as if bracing for something he already understood. The general continued, "This base, this command structure, and many of the operations we discuss today exist because of actions taken long before most of us in uniform today even began our service." The words created a ripple of curiosity through the gathered personnel. Michael did not move. He simply listened, his hands resting naturally at his sides. The general took a slow step forward, closing the small distance between himself and Michael. For a brief moment, he looked down at the veteran's forearm where the faded tattoo had been partially visible earlier in the morning. Then, without hesitation, the general carefully rolled up his own sleeve. A collective shift occurred among the nearby observers as a similar marking became visible on his arm. It was weathered, clearly older, and identical in design. The reaction was immediate. Subtle gasps spread among the closest personnel. Ethan froze, his eyes fixed on the matching symbol. The general spoke again, this time with a tone that carried both respect and memory. "This is not decoration," he said. "It is a reminder of a mission that changed everything for those of us who survived it." The air seemed to tighten further as those words settled. Michael finally glanced at the general's arm, and for the first time that morning, his calm expression softened slightly, as if acknowledging something long buried in shared experience. The general continued, "There were men and women who never returned, and there were others who ensured that some of us did. What remains is not written in reports that most people will ever read. It lives in memory and in the people who carry it." Ethan felt a growing discomfort in his chest as pieces of understanding began to form. The jokes from earlier now felt distant and misplaced, replaced by a realization that he had been looking at the situation without context. Around them, the base had become completely silent. Even the aircraft engines in the distance seemed muted, as though the entire installation had paused to witness something personal and deeply significant. The general lowered his sleeve again and stepped back slightly, but his attention remained on Michael. "It is good to see you standing here today," he said quietly. Michael gave a slight nod. "Some things are never really left behind," he replied. The exchange was simple, but it carried a depth that no one nearby could ignore. Ethan looked down for a moment, then back at the two men, realizing that what he had assumed to be ordinary had been far from it all along. The atmosphere across Falcon Ridge Air Base shifted again, no longer defined by ceremony or routine, but by the weight of a history that had just been quietly revealed in front of everyone. The moment General Robert Anderson revealed the matching mark on his forearm, the atmosphere across Falcon Ridge Air Base shifted into complete stillness, as if time itself had briefly paused to allow the weight of the revelation to settle. No one spoke. No one moved beyond small, involuntary adjustments of posture. Even the distant activity of the base felt subdued, replaced by the concentrated attention of everyone gathered near the reviewing platform. Ethan Brooks remained frozen in place, his earlier confidence fully replaced by uncertainty. He looked from the general to Michael Carter, and then back again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had assumed only minutes earlier. The symbol that had once been the subject of jokes among his team now carried a meaning that clearly extended far beyond anything he had imagined. Michael Carter stood calmly, his expression steady but no longer distant. There was a quiet recognition in his eyes, as though he had expected this moment but had not sought it. The general lowered his arms slowly and took a small step closer again, ensuring that his words would carry clearly to those nearest the platform. "This mark represents more than service," he said. "It represents survival, trust, and a mission that demanded more than most people will ever understand." A few officers nearby exchanged subtle glances, their expressions reflecting growing realization that they were witnessing something deeply personal rather than ceremonial. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, suddenly aware of how misplaced his earlier comments had been. The laughter that had once felt harmless now returned to his memory with uncomfortable clarity. The general continued, his tone steady but softened by time and memory. "There are operations that never make it into official records in full detail. Not because they are unimportant, but because they are too sensitive and too costly to summarize in simple terms. What matters is not recognition. What matters is that people came home because of decisions made in moments that most will never hear about." Michael finally spoke again, his voice calm and measured. "And because of those decisions, others were able to continue their lives," he said. His words were not defensive, nor were they explanatory. They were simply factual, grounded in lived experience. The general nodded once in agreement. Around them, the surrounding personnel remained silent, absorbing the weight of what had just been said. The retired Chief Master Sergeant who had been observing earlier stepped slightly forward but stopped short of entering the main circle of attention. His expression suggested recognition mixed with long-held respect. Ethan, however, felt a growing sense of discomfort not because of fear, but because of understanding. He began to realize that the man he had dismissed was not someone who needed validation from anyone present. Instead, he was someone whose presence alone carried history that others were only now beginning to comprehend. The general turned slightly toward the assembled personnel and addressed them in a broader voice. "Today was scheduled as a demonstration and inspection," he said. But it is also a reminder that rank, appearance, and assumptions can never replace knowledge of true service. His gaze briefly returned to Michael as he finished speaking. Some individuals here are not simply veterans of time. They are part of the foundation upon which current operations exist. The words settled heavily across the airfield. No one reacted outwardly, but the shift in perception was visible in the way people now looked at Michael. The earlier amusement that had circulated among the younger operators had completely disappeared. Ethan finally lowered his head slightly, no longer attempting to justify his earlier behavior, but instead silently processing what he had learned. Michael did not acknowledge the change in attention. He simply stood as he had from the beginning, neither seeking recognition nor avoiding it. The general stepped back into position beside him, and for a brief moment, both men stood facing the assembled base in quiet unity. The atmosphere had changed permanently, not through command or ceremony, but through the quiet unveiling of truth that no one present could ignore. The silence that followed the general's statement remained unbroken as the weight of history settled across Falcon Ridge Air Base. The assembled personnel stood still, not out of protocol alone, but out of a growing awareness that they were no longer observing a routine inspection. Instead, they were witnessing something far more personal and deeply rooted in shared experience. Ethan Brooks remained near the edge of the formation, his attention fully fixed on Michael Carter and General Robert Anderson. The earlier confidence he had carried throughout the morning was gone, replaced by a quiet reflection he did not yet know how to express. Michael continued to stand calmly, his posture unchanged, as though the attention now directed toward him was something he had long learned to accept without seeking it. The general took a slow step forward, gesturing subtly for the surrounding officers to remain at ease while he spoke more informally. His voice softened, shifting away from announcement toward reflection. "There are moments in service that never leave those who experience them," he said. "Not because they are written down, but because they are carried forward." He turned slightly toward Michael as he continued. "There was a mission many years ago that required decisions under conditions that cannot be easily described in standard briefings. What matters most is not the operation itself, but the people who made it possible for others to return safely." A few of the older personnel in the crowd exchanged subtle nods, as if recognizing fragments of a shared past that had rarely been spoken about openly. Ethan listened carefully now, no longer focused on assumptions but on understanding. The general continued, his tone steady but increasingly personal. "During that time, this man standing beside me made choices that affected every outcome that followed. He did not seek acknowledgment then, and he is not seeking it now." Michael finally shifted his gaze toward the gathered personnel. His expression remained composed, but there was a quiet depth in his eyes that suggested the memory carried both weight and meaning. "We did what was necessary," Michael said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. The simplicity of his words contrasted sharply with the significance they implied. Around him, the atmosphere changed again, not with tension, but with a growing sense of respect. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, absorbing the realization that the man he had spoken about casually earlier in the day had been part of something far beyond his assumptions. The retired Chief Master Sergeant stepped forward slightly, now close enough to be seen clearly by those nearby. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "There are names and actions that never appear in official summaries," he said. "But those who were there do not forget." The general nodded once in agreement. "And when those individuals appear again in moments like this, it is not for recognition. It is for remembrance." A respectful silence followed his words. The air base, usually filled with the constant rhythm of movement and sound, now felt suspended in stillness. Even the distant aircraft engines seemed to fade into the background as attention remained focused on the central platform. Ethan took a slow breath, his perspective shifting in a way that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. He no longer saw Michael as an ordinary visitor or a retired veteran sharing old stories. Instead, he began to understand that experience and contribution were not always visible in the ways he had been trained to recognize. Michael adjusted his sleeve slightly, covering the weathered mark on his forearm once more. The gesture was simple, unremarkable, yet it carried a sense of finality. He was not presenting himself for validation, nor was he rejecting the attention now directed toward him. He was simply returning to stillness after acknowledgment had been made. The general looked out across the assembled personnel one final time before speaking. "Let today serve as a reminder," he said, "that respect is not assigned by rank or appearance, but earned through actions that often remain unseen." The words lingered in the air as the crowd absorbed their meaning. Ethan remained silent, now fully aware that the lessons of the morning extended far beyond the boundaries of the base. The atmosphere gradually shifted back toward order, but something had permanently changed in the way those present viewed the man standing quietly at the center of it all. As the formal acknowledgment concluded, Falcon Ridge Air Base slowly began returning to its structured rhythm, but the atmosphere had permanently changed in ways that could not be reversed. Personnel resumed their positions, yet conversations remained subdued, as if everyone instinctively understood that what they had witnessed required silence rather than commentary. Ethan Brooks stood near the edge of the formation longer than the others, still processing the sequence of events that had unfolded in front of him. The man he had dismissed earlier in the day was now at the center of a story far larger than anything he had anticipated. Michael Carter remained composed, his attention no longer focused on the crowd but instead on the quiet space around him. There was no sign of pride or expectation, only a calm acceptance of recognition that he had never sought. General Robert Anderson turned slightly toward him and lowered his voice as they stepped away from the main viewing platform, allowing the formal proceedings to resume in the background. "You have not changed," the general said. Michael responded with a faint nod. "Neither have you," he replied. The exchange carried a familiarity that suggested years of shared experience, rather than a single moment of reunion. Nearby, Ethan observed quietly as members of the unit began to disperse. Some avoided eye contact with Michael, not out of disrespect, but out of a new awareness that they had misjudged him earlier. Others looked toward him with uncertainty, unsure whether to approach or maintain distance. The retired Chief Master Sergeant who had been observing throughout the morning slowly walked closer to Ethan. His expression was calm but firm. "It is easy to assume you understand someone based on what you see first," he said quietly. Ethan nodded, acknowledging the truth without argument. "I made a mistake," he admitted. The older man did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward Michael and the general, who were now speaking in low tones a short distance away. "Mistakes happen," the Chief Master Sergeant said. "What matters is whether you learn from them before it becomes a pattern." Ethan remained silent, absorbing the weight of those words. Meanwhile, Michael and General Anderson had paused near the edge of the flight line, where the sound of distant engines created a steady backdrop. The general spoke again, this time with a tone that was more reflective than official. "There are very few people I have served with who would have handled that morning the way you did," he said. Michael replied calmly. "There is no reason to react to things that do not require reaction." The general gave a slight, knowing smile. "That is exactly why they never understood you back then either." A brief silence followed, filled not with discomfort but with understanding. Ethan, standing at a respectful distance, found himself listening more carefully now, realizing that the conversation carried layers of history he had only begun to recognize. The general then glanced toward Ethan and the other operators. "They are still learning," he said quietly. Michael followed his gaze and nodded once. "They are supposed to," he replied. "That is how it should be." Those words carried no judgment, only acceptance. Ethan felt a subtle shift within himself as he heard them. The embarrassment he had carried earlier began to transform into something more constructive, a recognition of how limited his perspective had been. The general adjusted his stance and looked across the airfield, where the formal program was now resuming in full. "This base will continue its mission today," he said. "But I think everyone here will remember this morning for reasons that have nothing to do with the schedule." Michael looked out across the runway briefly, then turned slightly as if preparing to step away from the central area. There was no announcement of departure, no formal closure, only a natural sense that his presence had already fulfilled its purpose. Ethan watched as Michael began walking slowly along the edge of the display area, moving with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning. For the first time, Ethan did not see an ordinary veteran or a subject of misplaced humor. He saw a man whose silence carried more meaning than any explanation. And as the activity of the base gradually returned to its normal pace, the understanding left behind by that morning remained quietly present in every mind that had witnessed it. The remainder of the formal program at Falcon Ridge Air Base continued in a structured but noticeably more subdued manner after the earlier revelation had reshaped the atmosphere. Personnel moved through their assigned duties with renewed focus, yet the emotional weight of what had occurred earlier still lingered across every section of the installation. Conversations were quieter, interactions more deliberate, and even the usual sounds of aircraft preparation seemed less dominant than before. Ethan Brooks remained with his unit, but his attention frequently drifted back toward the central reviewing area where Michael Carter and General Robert Anderson had stood together only moments earlier. The image of their shared recognition stayed fixed in his mind, challenging the assumptions he had carried throughout the morning. As the formal inspection resumed, the general eventually returned to the central platform to address the assembled personnel in a more official capacity. His presence immediately restored structure to the gathering, and all remaining movement gradually aligned with protocol. Michael Carter stood slightly behind and to the side, no longer at the center of attention, yet still observed by many who now regarded him differently than before. Ethan watched as the general raised his voice just enough to reach the assembled groups. "Today is not only an inspection of readiness," he said, "but also a reminder of continuity. Every individual here stands on a foundation built by those who came before." His words were measured, intended not as ceremony, but as reflection. Several officers nodded in acknowledgment. The general continued, "There are names and contributions that are not always present in official briefings, but their impact is present in every operation we conduct." At that moment, he briefly glanced toward Michael, who remained still and composed. Ethan noticed the gesture and understood its significance without needing further explanation. After the address concluded, the formal inspection began to transition toward demonstration segments. Aircraft engines started at a distance, and ground crews resumed coordinated activity. The base slowly returned to its expected rhythm, but the earlier shift in perception remained unchanged. Ethan finally stepped away from his unit for a brief moment, and walked toward the edge of the viewing area where Michael had moved. He hesitated before speaking, aware that his earlier behavior had been inappropriate. When he finally approached, he kept his voice respectful. "Sir," Ethan said, "I want to apologize for earlier today." Michael turned slightly toward him, acknowledging his presence without hesitation or judgment. Ethan continued, "I spoke without understanding the situation, and I was wrong to make assumptions." There was a brief pause before Michael responded. His tone remained calm and steady. "Assumptions are common," he said. "What matters is whether a person recognizes them in time to correct them." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the response. "I understand," he replied. Michael looked at him for a moment longer, then gave a subtle nod of acceptance. "That is enough," he said simply. The exchange was brief, but it carried more weight than a longer conversation might have. Achieved. Ethan stepped back slightly, allowing space, but remained nearby as Michael turned his attention once again toward the flight line. In the distance, General Anderson observed the interaction quietly. There was no interruption, only quiet approval. He then stepped forward and joined them, his presence calm and deliberate. "You handled that as expected," the general said to Michael. Michael responded without looking away from the airfield. "There is no need to complicate what is already clear." The general gave a faint smile. "That is why they still listen when you speak," he replied. Around them, the formal inspection continued, aircraft moving through demonstrations and personnel executing coordinated procedures. Yet beneath the surface of activity, a quieter transformation had taken place. Ethan stood a short distance away, no longer viewing the day through assumptions or humor, but through understanding and reflection. The events of the morning had not changed the mission of the base, but they had permanently changed the way those who witnessed them understood the meaning of service, respect, and unseen history. As the sun began to lower over Falcon Ridge Air Base, the formal inspection and demonstration segments gradually reached their final stages. Aircraft had completed their passes, ground crews had executed their final procedures, and the structured rhythm of the day slowly transitioned toward closure. Yet despite the return to routine operations, the atmosphere remained fundamentally different from how it had begun. What had once been a standard public military event had transformed into a moment of reflection for many who had witnessed it. Ethan Brooks stood with his unit near the edge of the flight line, no longer speaking about earlier impressions or making casual remarks. His focus was quiet and internal, shaped by everything he had observed throughout the day. The presence of Michael Carter, once dismissed without thought, now carried meaning that Ethan could not ignore. Across the installation, General Robert Anderson completed the final coordination with base leadership. His role in the inspection was coming to an end, but he remained near the central area alongside Michael Carter. The two men stood in calm silence for a few moments, watching the last of the activity settle into order. There was no urgency in their posture, only the ease of individuals who shared a long history that required no explanation. The general eventually spoke in a low voice. "It is rare to see a day unfold in a way that reminds people of what truly matters," he said. Michael responded without turning his gaze away from the airfield. "People only forget until something brings it back into focus," he replied. The general nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in the statement. "Today brought it back for many of them," he said. Nearby, Ethan observed quietly, understanding that the conversation was not intended for the audience around them, but carried a deeper meaning between two individuals who had shared experiences beyond what most could imagine. As the final announcements echoed across the base signaling the end of the event, personnel began to disperse in an orderly fashion. Families exited designated viewing areas, officers returned to their units, and the formal structure of the day dissolved into normal operations. Despite this, many continued to glance toward Michael as they passed, now with a level of respect that had not been present earlier. Ethan finally stepped forward one last time, stopping at a respectful distance. He did not speak immediately, choosing instead to acknowledge the moment with silence. Michael turned slightly, recognizing his presence. There was no tension, no expectation, only quiet understanding. Ethan spoke briefly. "Thank you for what you said earlier," he said. Michael gave a small nod. "It was not necessary to say much," he replied. "Understanding takes time, not words." Ethan accepted the response without hesitation. "I will remember that," he said. Michael looked at him for a moment longer, then turned his attention back toward the airfield one final time. The general approached from the side and stood beside him again. "They will talk about today," he said quietly. Michael responded with calm certainty. "That is not what matters." The general gave a faint, knowing smile. "No," he agreed. "What matters is what they carry forward from it." As the last of the personnel cleared the main viewing areas, Michael adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave the central platform. There was no ceremony in his departure, no announcement or recognition beyond what had already occurred. He simply began walking toward the exit path along the perimeter of the base, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Ethan watched from a distance as he left, realizing that nothing about Michael Carter had ever required attention to be significant. The general remained standing for a moment longer before turning away to complete his final duties. The air base slowly returned to its usual state of operations, but the impact of the day remained embedded in the memory of those who had witnessed it. What began as misunderstanding and casual dismissal had transformed into a lasting reminder that true experience and quiet service often reveal themselves only when assumptions are set aside, leaving behind a lesson that would stay with many long after the day had ended.